Has the time come to establish a localized form of Buddhism in areas like Canada, certain areas of the United States, South America, Europe, Africa, and other places where Buddhism is not overly present? This is not a new question by any stretch of the imagination, and many who practice in existing Buddhist traditions tend to dismiss such an idea. But there are signs that indicate that the ripening may be taking place to allow for such a new school of Buddhism. And I'm going to start off this particular podcast with a discussion, not of the merits necessarily from a Buddhist perspective of why this might be a good idea, but actually taking something from Christian history. There are two examples in the history of Christianity that lend themselves to a discussion about whether a new form of Buddhism, or at least some form of new organism of Buddhism for tailored to localized practices, psychology, history, and needs, may actually be beneficial. And the two examples that I'm going to look at are the history of Japanese Christianity and Irish Christianity, in particular, although you could say Celtic Christianity as a broader sense. And these two examples point to the reality of a new religion spreading into frontier lands, so to speak, or wilderness, that are detached from the basic core infrastructure of the spiritual tradition. And we'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that as we go along. But this is a situation that many in North America, particularly in Canada, certain areas of the United States, and other areas of the world, are actually undergoing, where there is great interest in Buddhism and great interest in developing community, but the sustaining infrastructure, meaning the ability to perpetuate a community through transmission of the precepts, the availability of local teachers, that sort of thing, where those are absent. And the result is that often practice communities may exist for one generation, but if they're isolated, it becomes difficult to sustain them beyond that. And the two examples that I mentioned, Japanese Christianity and Irish Christianity of the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, actually show two contrasting examples of what can happen when you are a new practitioner to a spiritual tradition that has not heretofore been super present in a particular area, and what can happen when the infrastructure is present and when it is absent. So I'm going to begin first speaking about Japanese Christianity that arrived in the 16th century. And what happened? There's, for those of you that are aware of Catholic history in Asia, particularly have an interest in Japanese Christianity, it's not a new or novel thing to say that it got off to a very rocky start. Catholicism in Japan arrived, and missionaries such as Francis Xavier, who was a Jesuit, began to missionize Japan in the 16th century. And Christianity, actually, there was an influx of priests from Europe who were missionizing Japan. And over time, there were a few Japanese priests that were ordained in order to sustain local communities. But as many be aware, if you haven't seen the movie Silence, the Martin Scorsese movie Silence, that gives a pretty good account of what happened with Catholic Christianity in Japan in its very early days. Due to political and ideological reasons, there was a great persecution of Christianity, as it was feared that it would threaten the political dominance of certain forces in Japan at the time. And so a clamp down on Christianity was ordered. And the persecution effectively squashed what might be a budding institutional church. And there's a particular reason why this is the case. When the persecution took place, existing priests fled the country or were executed by state officials, thereby sort of cutting off those institutional roots from the Roman Church at the time. Now, in Roman Catholic Christianity, what you may know is the role of the priests and bishops and deacons in terms of sustaining local liturgy and community are really essential in that system of spirituality. If you don't have a priest, you can't celebrate Mass, for instance. If you don't have a bishop, you can't ordain priests and deacons to sort of perpetuate that tradition. And while there was a short period in the early 1600s where there was a bishop that came to Japan and did ordain a few Japanese priests, the persecution basically took care of all of that. And those priests were laicized effectively or killed, and any European priests were sent packing or killed as well. And this left hundreds of thousands of Japanese, conceivably, in a situation where they were cut off from their institutional roots. They had no ability to perpetuate clergy. They had no ability. They could celebrate baptism, but they couldn't celebrate confession. They couldn't celebrate the Eucharist, and they had a very localized lay practice. And they were also cut off from the tradition in that way because they didn't have any teachers that were able to sort of continue on the traditional Catholic faith, which led to a very interesting form of unique, localized Japanese Christianity that when the doors opened in Japan again in the 19th century, many people didn't recognize as Christian. But that's a discussion for another time. The overall theme that I'm getting with in terms of Japanese Christianity is it was not part of the Roman Empire, obviously, and therefore had not been missionized early and was free from sort of the Roman infrastructure that had basically latched itself onto the Catholic Church. And so Japan was entirely dependent on missionary priests coming in to provide the sacraments, to build communities, but when they were absent, the community effectively fell into disarray. There were a number of practitioners that continued to practice underground, but again, they weren't able to perpetuate that spiritual system after the priests had left, and they were cut off from the rest of the Christian world as a result. And as a matter of fact, the first Japanese person to be ordained a Catholic bishop wasn't actually ordained until the 19th century. And so when the doors reopened, then there was an opportunity for more missionaries to come in. And I think what happened is they realized pretty quickly from history that if you don't have the institutional roots in the area that you're serving, the community may fracture. And it may not sort of adhere to sort of the larger teachings and community. And that's an example of where a missionary religion went out into sort of the frontier lands where Christianity was not sort of the native religion, and what happened when the infrastructure elements were pulled and the roots cut, and the communities no longer had the ability to sustain themselves. Another example of where this was actually somewhat the case, but it ended up different due to slightly different circumstances, was Ireland. Ireland in particular, although I said, like I said, Celtic Christianity in general. Irish Christianity, Ireland had received Christians long before the 5th century, but Irish Christianity really didn't take off until about the 5th century. And one of the things, there were a number of unique elements to Irish Christianity that were different from sort of mainstream Roman Christianity. For instance, the structure of the community was very different. Rather than being based on bishops and dioceses, like in the more mainstream Romanized Catholic tradition, it was very much centered on the monastics. It was the abbot, not the bishop. In fact, there were bishops in the abbey who were actually subservient to the abbot in Irish Christianity. So organizationally, it was different in that way. It was also different in the sense that monasteries and Christianity in Ireland in those early days were much more based around clan structures as opposed to diocesan or Roman administrative structures. So the organization was quite different. Further, monks weren't necessarily static. They would go to a monastery for a particular time, study with a teacher, study with a monastic, spend some time in the monastery, and then move on and possibly found their own community. But they had the ability, they received some of that training and were able to go forth and set up their own monastic structures. There are other elements that were unique about Irish Christianity. For instance, they calculated the date of Easter differently. A lot of the liturgy practices were different than the mainstream Roman practices. Their perspective on the role of nature in relation to spirituality was a lot closer to what would later come about as Franciscan spirituality than traditional mainstream Roman. And that impacted actually not necessarily the theology of God, and the theology of Christianity wasn't necessarily tremendously different in Ireland, but there was different emphasis placed on various aspects about the characteristics and nature of God, largely from these perspectives of the closeness of nature, living in harmony with nature, and how that impacted sort of a Christian perspective. You can tell this from some of the prayers, the early Irish prayers, when you compare them with sort of mainstream Roman, on the continent, or even in London and that area, were very different. They had a different emphasis. They had a different sort of localized flavor and character. And in fact, a lot of the practices in Irish Christianity took on a lot of the local cultural flavors as well. So there were differences between the Irish Christianity and sort of the mainstream, different emphasis, different structures of organization, different views of the world, and even to an extent the nature of who Christ was, the nature of God even. And this probably was the case in Japan too, but unlike the Japanese example, Celtic Christianity, in fact, didn't die out, it flourished, even though it was on the margins. And I missed one thing, and it's actually probably the most important thing. Why was it that Irish Christianity was so much different than Roman Christianity in London and on the continent, etc.? And the answer is very simple. Ireland was outside of the Roman Empire. There was no Roman influence there. There was no Roman infrastructure there. So like Japan to a certain extent, their Roman structures were not present. And so it was much more locally, culturally based in terms of organization and the way that how they practiced their Christianity. Yet, what's interesting is they maintained the institutional ties to Rome. So even though, and probably this is likely a function of geography as much as anything else, I recognize that when we're comparing Irish and Japanese Christianity, and obviously the modalities of getting around the world were much more difficult to get to Japan than Ireland. However, Ireland was outside of the Roman Empire. It was outside the mainstream Roman Catholic influence. The difference is that there was a continuous connection with the mainstream church through the infrastructure where Ireland was able to perpetuate Celtic Christianity for a lot longer before Romanization occurred in the 8th or 9th century. So they had several hundred years of a localized form of Christian practice that was connected to the larger Christian tradition, but they did things on their own until the point they were Romanized about 1200 years ago. And that is a case in point where having the ability to have that connection with the mainstream traditions via the mechanism of being able to ordain clergy, the ability to sort of perpetuate beyond one generation sort of the leadership of the local Christian communities and having access to teachers and that sort of thing, make a huge difference in terms of sustaining the community when those things are largely absent. And in the Irish case, as we discussed, they kind of did things their own way, but they had that ability, that connection through the mainstream Catholic religion to be legitimate, quote unquote, but kind of do things their own way as well. These two cases in point actually make the case, in my view, that there should be something of a tradition in Buddhism that kind of follows the Celtic Christian way of doing things, where they're attached to the broader Buddhist teachings and the ability and have their roots in traditional Buddhist teaching, but also have the ability to perpetuate the infrastructure themselves, rather than relying on missionaries from the outside, or rather than having to necessarily send people great distances to receive training who may or may not come back. They could do it in-house. They could do it locally. And the church was able to furnish that sort of structure, to enable them to ordain new priests and new bishops, to allow people to celebrate Mass and the sacraments and all these sorts of things. This is what's needed, I believe, for areas of Canada, the United States, and other places that are largely outside the larger sphere of influence of mainstream Buddhism, regardless of lineage and tradition. There may be outposts here and there, but the overall land is geographically and culturally and any number of other reasons sort of separated from that mainstream Buddhist infrastructure. Allowing local communities, bestowing upon them the ability to connect to the mainstream traditions through developing local infrastructure to perpetuate themselves, is a key feature. And if, potentially what could happen down the road is that would begin to transform the local culture to make it a little bit more of a mainstream tradition within the local area. In Canada, and I'll use the Canadian example, Buddhism has been present in Canada for about 120 years. And in various forms, and probably, I'm going to say 95% or more of that presence has been the result of immigrants from Asia coming to Canada and establishing, communities from their roots in Asia and continuing in Buddhist teachings within sort of that traditional pathway back through lineages and that sort of thing. And it has allowed them to sort of perpetuate Buddhism. One of the things is for many of these communities, though, is that there isn't sort of a local in-house ability to regenerate these communities, although that is starting to change more and more. That is the case. But for a very long time, they relied on missionaries coming to serve those local ethnic communities. And the focus of these missionaries was on those local ethnic communities. It was not so much on sort of quote unquote evangelizing the broader area around. It was very focused on maintaining those local communities. As time has gone on, particularly in, like I said, I'm speaking from the Canadian example, this is true elsewhere, there is much more of a local interest in Buddhism than there was before. And that's through the distribution of information, and certainly the internet has been helpful in this. And the result is that there is a rather fertile field for Buddhism here. The problem is the infrastructure. There is not, at least right now, in many areas of Canada, many areas of the United States for that matter, and other areas around the world, while they may start to practice in a particular spiritual tradition, minus the persecution, of course, they find themselves in kind of a similar situation to the Japanese Christians, because they have no mechanism to perpetuate themselves. There's nobody present locally who can bestow the precepts, who can establish new teachers, who can provide, training, etc. The internet is a help, and that has been a game changer. And COVID was, we see the growth of these practice communities, but it's still marginal in the sense that local communities are very reliant on those connections far, far away in order to perpetuate themselves. One of the pieces of advice when I've brought this topic up is start an established, Buddhist lineage and see what happens. Well, that's kind of what's been going on for 60 years in Canada, which is sort of when Buddhism started to become a little bit part of the consciousness of Westerners in Canada and in the United States, etc. That's very typical advice. And certainly is good advice to start, where you train in an existing tradition, etc. You see where it goes. That's what I did. I established 3 different communities, that all of which are still active, but there is a missing ingredient still, and that is the ability to perpetuate the community, to be able to ordain people locally, to help people ripen to become teachers that will serve locally, etc. This is still very much an uphill struggle for a lot of local communities. Where I'm at in Edmonton, Alberta, it's less of an issue because there's access to some Buddhist teachers in the area. There's access to travel, to go elsewhere. However, it remains expensive and rather arduous if you're trying to maintain a regular life, to train, to go, to come back. And that's been the issue too. Lots of Canadians have gone abroad to train and ordain. Problem is they never come back. They never come back to the local community to help grow and perpetuate. They just kind of take off and get absorbed into the Buddhist infrastructure in other areas. They don't actually come back with what they learned to necessarily perpetuate. That's not always the case, but a lot of the time that's the case. And so this is the issue, is that to a degree, obviously, again, minus the persecution, and there are other resources available, a lot of smaller Buddhist communities in what quote unquote remote areas, at least remote in the sense of the broader Buddhist infrastructure, find themselves without the ability to perpetuate through the ordination of people who, can, bestow precepts and become teachers and that sort of thing. It's still very, very difficult. Whereas in other areas of the world, the example I use is Japan. You can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Zen monastery or a Zen temple, and it's very easy to go in and practice. And if you want to ordain, it's a lot easier process there to ordain than it is here, because there's teachers readily available all over the place who can help you do that. If you want to train and become a teacher, well, it's an hour down the road. You have to take the time to go and do it, but it's like literally right over there. And so the difference between that and what's going on here is stark. It's not that, doing so in Japan doesn't come with some degree of sacrifice. It does, obviously. But it's sort of a fifth of the sacrifice of what happens for folks here. And like I said, a lot of people who do that sort of thing don't come back to the local community, and aren't there to, and the local community isn't there really to support them, to really grow anything bigger. So it's kind of this catch-22 situation where, even in 2026, when I'm doing this video, the local means to perpetuate the community aren't really there. And so the proposal is to establish something that can help with that. And to do that is to basically establish a structure of a community that can ordain people locally to bestow the precepts, to help train people, to help ripen people to teaching. And then through that, it will flower in local communities. They will grow. They will become more established. You'll have, in Celtic Christianity, as I was mentioning, one of the big things is that monks weren't necessarily static. They didn't live necessarily in one particular monastery. They were there for a little while. And then they would missionize into other areas. So you'd actually have wandering monks that would go and establish. And then eventually there was a mechanism to ordain people there, to have, to celebrate Mass and the sacraments. And so it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew because the system itself was flexible. It was much more of it was rural, it was very connected to nature, it was even the monastic rules in Ireland were noticeably ascetically harsh, but they were very relaxed in terms of, whether a monk had to spend their whole life in the monastery or not. They were missionary, and they were missionary at their core, meaning that people who had received, ordination, the teachings, were free to wander to go establish a new community elsewhere. And they would train up local people, then they would, and they would either help them become monks locally, or they would ordain them if there was a bishop present that could just do that. And it worked. It really grew the Catholic Celtic Christian community for hundreds of years. And unique local practices came up. So one of the other pieces in this discussion is many of the cultural aspects of mainstream Buddhist tradition kind of don't make a lot of sense to other local communities in the West. And there have been great strides from teachers such as Thich Nhat Hanh and others, Shinryu Suzuki was another, to really sort of try and translate the practice into a little bit more of a Western cultural, psychological, historical perspective. But more work can be done. And the idea behind this system too would be this organism, that we get tangled up in language, this organism, this methodology, this approach could be that to allow those local traditions to establish themselves while maintaining the core teachings of the tradition. One of the biggest fears in Buddhism is that as Buddhism spreads and grows into new lands, there is a fear that the teachings will be lost and that the core tradition will be lost. And it's understandable. This is an understandable worry, but sometimes you got to take a chance and you got to try and do this. And these local communities will have the added benefit of things like the internet and that sort of thing to maintain and be educated and trained with the local community, with larger Buddhist infrastructure, but also begin to really drop down roots in a local setting to the point where they can perpetuate the teachings and, their communities beyond one generation. This is the elevator pitch. And some people, they do not believe that this is necessary. They're very happy to maintain themselves in established traditions. Any tradition or any sort of organism, such as what I'm talking about here, has to remain connected to the teachings of Buddhism for sure. But we can't be overly fanatical about this. We cannot be overly fundamental about this. That is sort of what's killing certain streams of Buddhism in countries that have been Buddhist for 1,000 years. And I'm going to use Japan as an example. Zen in Japan is dying. I equate part of the issue with this with the fact that they are incredibly rigid in structure. Soto Zen in particular, about all the hoop jumping and steps that need to happen in order to sort of perpetuate a community, and it's heavily bureaucratic, etc. Beautiful tradition. But it's hard enough to do that in Japan, let alone transplant that elsewhere. And that is a problem that I know that many Soto Zen is looking at, ways to sort of work with that in other areas of the world. It's very limited in terms of where the areas that they can touch, and that makes sense. So something like an organism like this that I am proposing sort of kind of leaps over that problem by allowing a little flexibility, by allowing a little fluidity, by allowing people who are ripened to a sufficient level to help perpetuate the community, local communities, and develop local traditions of Buddhism. There it is. So that's my initial elevator pitch and initial episode. I definitely open to comment and discussion on this.